So I want to tell you about the latest batch of research that I've done. It has to do with timing, and let me tell you how I came to do this research. It came out of a mix of frustration and curiosity. The frustration was that I was making all kinds of timing decisions in my own life, but I was making them in a very sloppy way. I was making them based on intuition and guesswork, and I said there's got to be a better way to make these decisions. So I started looking around for guidance. It didn't exist. That surprised me. And that got me curious. I said, well, there's got to be some research on this question. In the last few books that I've written have looked at a lot of social science research. I said, there's got to be some research on this question. And that took me down a rabbit hole for 2 years. 2 years in the rabbit hole of research on timing. It turns out there's a lot of research on timing. There is a huge amount of research on timing, but the challenge is that it's splattered across multiple disciplines. And those of you who are academics know and often lament that academics don't often talk to each other across disciplines. So you have research being done by economists and social psychologists. You have research being done, though, by anthropologists, by cognitive scientists, by endocrinologists, by anesthesiologists. There's a whole field called chronobiology, and yet these folks aren't talking to each other. It's only been in the last 10 years that the economists started talking to the psychologists, barely, right? They're not talking to the anthropologists. They're not talking to the cognitive scientists. No one's talking to the endocrinologists, understandably. And yet they're all asking very similar questions. And the questions they're asking are this: what's the effect of time of day on what we do and how we do it? How do beginnings affect our behavior? How do midpoints affect our behavior? How do endings affect our behavior? And if you go wide enough and deep enough into this research, as I've tried to do, you can begin to piece together the evidence-based ways to make better, smarter, shrewder decisions about when to do stuff. So if there's one big idea, one animating idea here, it's this. We believe that timing is an art, but it's really a science. There's evidence on this. There's data on this. We are, after all, at a People Analytics Conference, right? The whole premise of this is that we want to make decisions about people based not on intuition and guesswork, but based on what the data say. And we can apply that fully and robustly to this question of timing. So this research is totally cool, totally interesting, and it answers a whole array of questions that I think are intriguing questions. Things like this: when should you exercise? Early in the day or late? Which is better? Oh, I'm not telling you the answer, but it's an interesting question, right? There's a clear answer to that question. Why should you never go into the hospital or schedule an important doctor's appointment in the afternoon? For reals, folks, don't do this. We'll talk about that in a second. Why are you, here you go, Wharton MBA students, why are you less likely to become CEO of a large company if you graduate from business school during a recession? The initial labor market conditions, the initial labor market conditions of our career have a huge effect on our wages and our career trajectory, huger than you would think, to the point where the effect lasts sometimes 20 years. Why don't teams actually get started until the midpoint of a project? There's some interesting research. You give a team this amount of time, they get started here. You give a team this amount of time, they get started here. Some interesting research on the effect of midpoints, on our motivation, on our behavior, on how we cohere. Why are you most likely to run your first marathon at age 29, 39, 49, and 59? Endings affect our behavior. This is totally cool here. Why is singing in a choir as good for your physical and mental health as exercise? The research on how groups coordinate in time is mind-boggling. And there's something about synchronizing with other people that makes us feel good, makes us do good. Other kinds of questions. I hope this one is not on your mind, but if it is, I'm here to help. When during the year is your spouse most likely to file for divorce? And it turns out there are 2 months of the year that have dramatic spikes in divorce filings. All right, here you go. If you've made it through the first 23 days of this month, you only have 8 days to go, all right? March is one of the big months for divorces, so you're almost there. But what I want to talk about is another question, sort of a fundamental question is this: how does the hidden pattern of the day affect our mood and our performance? And I want to just focus on the day, because one of the things I discovered in writing about time and timing is that a lot of things we think of as organic, as natural, are not. A second is not a real thing. It's something that human beings made up, right? An hour is not a real thing. It's something that human beings made up. A week is not a thing. It's something that human beings made up. But a day is a thing. All right? A day is, this is the level of scientific sophistication I'm bringing to this conference here. A day is a thing, right? Because we're on a planet, and that planet is turning. So let's talk about this question right here. How does the hidden pattern of the day affect our mood and our performance? And what's interesting about this, and I think relevant for all of you who are interested in analytics, is how much analytics, big data, has allowed us to see the invisible. Let me give you some examples of this. So what I want to do here is give you 2 studies on mood, 2 studies on performance, then we'll pay it off. First study comes from 2 researchers at Cornell. They used a program some of you are familiar with called LIWC, Linguistic Inventory and Word Count. It's basically a massive text analyzer. So it can take large bodies of text and do some very sophisticated analysis. Among the analysis that it can do is it can measure the emotional valence of the words. So it could take a corpus of novels, encyclopedias, anything, put it in there. It can do all kinds of groovy stuff, but it can measure, how much positive sentiment is being conveyed, how much negative sentiment is being conveyed. So these 2 researchers at Cornell took a very interesting corpus of text. It wasn't novels, it wasn't encyclopedias, it wasn't newspaper articles, it was tweets. 500 million tweets, all right? That's a lot of tweets, 500 million tweets. This is the big in big data, right? 500 million tweets from 2.5 million users, none of whom were president of the United States, in 84 countries, all right? So this is a big data set, right? This is interesting. This is what you're here for. How can we see the invisible using this big data set? And they said, well, wait a second. This is interesting because tweets, we know what time of day they're sent out. So we can measure the emotional level of tweets and plot it against time of day. We can see whether people's moods are changing over the course of a day. Very interesting. What did they find out? Here's what they found out. Positive mood rose in the morning, declined in the mid-afternoon, and rose later in the day. A peak, a trough, and a recovery. And I just want to thank all the folks at People Analytics for scheduling me where they did. So basically, it's basically the only moment of the day when you're extremely low but can go lower, all right? So thank you for that. So it's bad now, it's going to get worse. A peak, a trough, a recovery. Interesting. Think about that for a moment. Let's go to another methodology. There's a fellow here named Daniel Kahneman. I had the privilege of interviewing Daniel Kahneman here at this conference a couple of years ago. Daniel Kahneman, psychologist, winner of the Nobel Prize in economics. He created with some other scholars, including Alan Kruger, who's an economist, head of the CEA for President Obama, a different methodology. He called it the day reconstruction method. The day reconstruction method. And basically it amounted to people keeping diaries, writing down the episodes of their day and how they were feeling while doing it. I'm happy now because I'm at Wharton People Analytics Conference. I'm sad now because I'm commuting in Philadelphia at 5 o'clock at night. Write down these things, analyze the data from hundreds and hundreds of people. What did Kahneman, Kruger et al. Find out? A peak, a trough, a recovery. And again, even on that one, we're low and going lower right now, all right? A peak, a trough, a recovery. Now, look at this. These are not the exact same chart, but here's the thing. They rhyme. They rhyme. These charts rhyme. Peak, trough, recovery. Up, down, up. That's mood. Let's talk about performance. Here it gets super interesting. And here we can use analytics once again to find out some cool stuff that's going on. So let's go to some research from NYU. This is totally interesting. So researchers from NYU used that Luke program to measure the emotional valence of a body of text, but what they decided to use were the transcripts of earnings calls from public companies. Public companies have earnings calls every quarter. They report what they're, we're at Wharton, we don't need to know what these are, right? So, but for those of you who were liberal arts majors undergrad, earnings calls are these moments when the CEO and the CFO get on the phone with a group of analysts and journalists. They report what the earnings were that past quarter. They give guidance for future earnings. These are high-stakes calls. So these researchers looked at the transcripts of 26,000 calls. Again, folks, this is the big and big data. This kind of research would have been impossible before this sort of technology. And what this is doing, I think that these kinds of technologies are equivalent, or analogous at least, to a microscope, right? Remember when the first well, you don't remember when the first microscope, but when the first microscope, I hope not. If you do, congratulations for being here. Think about the first microscope. The revolution of a microscope was like, holy crap, there's a whole world down there. This is amazing. We've never seen this before. I think that big data is doing something very similar. Wow, we're seeing things we're not able to see before. These researchers look at the 26,000 earnings calls, 2,100 companies, 6.5 years. They're measuring the emotional valence of the words. Is there a difference in the emotion of the words used in earnings calls based on time of day? Some companies do the calls early, some companies do the calls late. Let's take a look. Afternoon calls were more negative, irritable, and combative, leading to temporary stock mispricings for firms hosting earnings calls later in the day. So think about that for a second. Does anybody ever participated in a public earnings call or been involved in? Okay, so tell me your first name. Michelle. Okay, I'm going to ask Michelle a couple questions here. So the people who are doing these calls, the CFO and the CEO, reasonably competent people in general? Yes. Okay. Second question. Do these CEOs and CFOs, do they prepare for these calls, Michelle? Yes. Michelle, is there anything at stake in these calls for these CFOs and CEOs? What's at stake, Michelle? Their share price, their own livelihoods. So what you have is you have talented people who are extremely well prepared. I don't know if you actually were involved in preparing them for this? No. But they rehearse, they have talking points, they moot the questions. You have talented people, extremely well prepared with something at stake, and yet they leak. Even if you control for the fundamentals, afternoon calls were more negative and irritable, leading to, this is the key point here, folks, temporary stock mispricings. I'm convinced there is someone out there who has written a program to exploit the delta between, I mean it seriously, the delta between the true price of the stock and the mispriced stock because of the negative sentiment in the afternoon. It's so bad that they do what academics rarely do, which is give people practical advice. They say, thank you for that, they say, an important takeaway from our study for corporate executives is that communications with investors and probably other critical managerial decisions and negotiations should be conducted earlier in the day. Let's talk about time of day effects on performance. Big data exhibit L. Where's got so many of these things? There's so much stuff out here. I'll give you one. Let's talk about standardized test scores. Let's talk about standardized test scores in Denmark. In Denmark, students take standardized tests, as they do here in the States. But in the States, we still typically take standardized tests on pencil and paper, Scantron, bubble forms, that kind of thing. In Denmark, they take tests on computers. However, the typical Danish school has more students than computers. As a result, everybody can't take the test at the same time. So the students are randomly assigned to take, yeah. The social scientists in the audience are weeping right now because this is it's like the most beautiful thing that could ever happen, right? Oh my God, a natural experiment. I can't believe it. What a world, all right? They're randomly assigned. Some take the test earlier in the day, some take the test later in the day. What's even better is that we have the numbers on all of these, and Francesca Gino at Harvard and her two Danish colleagues looked at 2 million standardized test scores. 2 million. It's a microscope. It's allowing us to see things that we wouldn't otherwise see. Okay, what do they find? For every hour later in the day, scores decrease. We find that an hour later in the day causes a deterioration in test score that is equivalent to slightly lower household income, less parental education, and missing 2 weeks of school. Whoa, that's alarming, right? This kid takes a test in the morning, this kid takes a test in the afternoon, and this kid scores lower, largely because of that timing. So we're going to make policy decisions based on standardized test scores when there's that heavy time of day effect? Worse, are we going to make decisions about this kid based on her scores if she had been randomly assigned elsewhere? Over and over again, we see this. Let's talk about healthcare for a second. Let's talk about healthcare. Anesthesia errors. 4 times more likely at 3 p.m. than at 9 a.m. We're on our way in a path toward plummeting mood anyway, so let's layer in talk about colonoscopies. Colonoscopies. Doctors who perform colonoscopies in the afternoon versus the morning find half as many polyps with the same population. Half as many polyps in afternoon exams as in morning exams. Katie Milkman here at Wharton did some really remarkable, again, big data research on hand washing in hospitals. Really ingenious study involving RFID, and just a really beautiful study. Hand washing in hospitals, huge deterioration in hand washing in hospitals. Over and over and over again, we see this. Over and over again, we see this. There is a distinct pattern of mood. There's a distinct pattern of performance. What do we know? What do we do about it? Let's pay this off. 3 key points. 3 key points. 1, what this research tells us? Our cognitive abilities do not remain the same over the course of a day. Period. Full stop. I wish I had learned this earlier in my life. Our cognitive abilities don't remain the same throughout the day. Very important. So when you're feeling differently cognitively, it's not because you're weak, it could be because you're weak, it could be because you're lazy, but that's not the automatic explanation, right? Our cognitive abilities change over the course of the day. 2, these daily fluctuations are more extreme than we realize. The difference between the daily high point and the daily low point can be dramatic. 3, the best time to perform a task depends on the nature of that task. For reals, this is big, folks. Take a picture. Take lots of pictures of it. Here, I'll get out of the way. All right, now, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? The good news here is that the science, I think, distills into some relatively simple, straightforward design principles. It doesn't tell us, oh, everybody should begin work at 7:40 a.m., work for 38 minutes, take a 12-minute break. It doesn't tell us that at all, but it gives us some design principles. Here's what it tells us. People tend to move through the day in 3 stages: a peak, a trough, a recovery. Most people move in that order. People who are extreme night owls, evening chronotypes, very complicated. Any people who are sort of consider themselves night owls, your best time of day is at night, do your best work at night, yeah. So basically, the whole corporate world is designed to crush your spirit. So I feel for you, owls. So owls, much more complicated, tend to move in the opposite pattern: recovery, trough, peak, recovery, trough, peak. But let's talk about the 80% of us who are not owls. We move through the day in 3 stages: peak, trough, recovery. Here's what the research tells us. During our peak, one of the characteristics of being in our peak cognitively is that we are extremely vigilant. What does it mean to be vigilant? Vigilant means we're able to bat away distractions. Bat away distractions. That makes it the ideal time for doing analytic work. Work that requires heads down, focus, and attention. Writing a report, writing a brief, analyzing data, going meticulous through step by step by step through a strategy. Work that requires that incredible focus and discipline, heads down. During the trough is not good for very much. It's actually a relatively dangerous time of day. So what should we be doing then? We should be doing our analytic work. We should be doing our administrative work. Sorry. We should be doing our administrative work, all right? Answering our routine emails, filling out our TPS reports, that kind of stuff. Now, the recovery is actually a really interesting time. Remember, typically you go through the day peak, trough, recovery. And the recovery has 2 characteristics. Remember, elevated mood, but we're less vigilant than during the peak. So pair those 2 things. Higher mood, less vigilance, that makes it a good time for what psychologists call insight problems. Problems that require more creativity. Think about brainstorming. The ideal situation for brainstorming is you want a little bit of looseness and a pretty good mood. If you're hyper-vigilant during brainstorming, you're going to be a less effective brainstormer because you're going to be batting away too many things. And that's pretty much it, folks. Those are the design principles. Here's the problem, as I wrap up. Here's the problem. We should be putting our analytic work during the peak, our administrative work during the trough, and our insight work during the recovery. Here's the problem. We don't do that. I'm a sinner on this. I'm a writer. I should be doing. I'm not quite a hardcore morning person, but I'm larky, and I should be doing my analytic work during the morning. So I've had many mornings before I was fully aware of this, where I'd come into the office and say, "Okay, got to do some writing. 8:30. Let's do some writing, Dan. First, I got to check a couple emails. A couple more emails. Send an email. Oh, there's probably something going on Twitter. Check that out. You know, and then 5 ESPN highlight reels later, it's lunchtime. And then I come back and have to do my analytic work during the trough, which is like riding uphill against a heavy wind. All right, but I'll give you another example. Let's think about organizations. Most of you who are Wharton students are going to go work at organizations. Think about how we schedule meetings in organizations. What are the we use only one criterion in scheduling meetings in organizations. What is it? Availability. That's it. We don't say, what kind of work is this? Is this analytic work? Is this brainstorming work? Is this an administrative meeting? Who's going to be there? People who are better in the morning? People who are better late in the evening? Just who's available. Doesn't matter. It matters. It matters a lot. So what do we do about this? Here are your takeaways. First, we're going to talk about this. Time of day effects. Explain 20% of the variance in human performance on cognitive tasks. That doesn't mean timing is everything, but it's a big thing. Here are your takeaways. 1, move analytic tasks to the peak, administrative tasks to the trough, and insight tasks to the recovery. It's going to vary. The particulars are going to vary from person to person, organization to organization. But if you're deliberate about that, you can be more effective. And the most important thing here is be much more deliberate and intentional in scheduling individual and team work. When people work often matters as much as what they do. And we're not deliberate and intentional about when. How many of you today had a to-do list? Anybody have a to-do list? That's intentionality about what you're doing. I'm intentional about what we're doing. We're intentional about how we do it. We're intentional about who we do it with. But we're not intentional to when we do things we should. Let me close on this. William James, the father of psychology, modern psychology, he said this line. It haunts me because I think about this a lot. He says, compared to what we ought to be, we are only half awake. We are only half awake. And I think that's true when it comes to the temporal dimensions of our life. We're only half awake. We have to be awake to the fact that we are temporal creatures. We have essentially biological clocks in every cell in our body. We are moving through time, right? I don't want to weird you out. I don't want to get too woo-woo on you here, but this presentation started in the past, and it's going to finish in the future. Whoa, right? It's kind of heady, right? Temporal creatures moving through time. We have an array of data, much of it through analytics, letting us know that time of day, just time of day alone, has a material effect on how we do things and how we feel about doing them. So what we have to do is widen our eyes. We have to be fully awake to these temporal dimensions of our life, be much more intentional about when questions. If we do those things, I think we can get more done. I think we can get better stuff done. And I think we can enjoy our lives a little bit more. Thank you.